Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to the channel. And what I'm going to do today is a little bit different than my usual content. I've really been struck by something that I feel like I need to talk about. I need to share my experience. I am a professor, I deal with graduate students, and I do research. And I want to let you know what some of that entails, some of the things that I've seen recently that concern me. And I was particularly inspired to get on and say something on this topic because a couple days ago I sat on a PhD dissertation defense, right? Which is the culmination of a student's project defending what they've done. And then if we approve of it, it's sort of the final step to saying you are a doctor. In fact, at the end of that meeting, when we called that student back in and said you passed, we all call that person doctor for the first time. It's a great moment. It's a really fun thing to be involved with. And it's one of my favorite parts of the job. Well, that PhD defense left me really inspired, partly because the student is awesome. I mean, the project was great. The amount of work, the findings they had were just really great to listen to hear, and to participate in. But I also found myself wondering, would this student be able to do this in another year or two? If they hadn't graduated now, what would happen to them in this current fiscal climate? In this climate of slashing basic science funding. You see, the student had spent 5 years involved in research on, let me just summarize it simply as trying to understand wound healing in diabetics. It's a big problem. Bacterial cultures, getting into wounds, festering wounds, and how do you get rid of those infections? There are some really broad, big things that we do, like antibiotics, obviously. And there's some other defenses for and treatments for wounds. But this student is working on a potential new treatment for wounds that is more speculative, right? It's a new idea, a new hypothesis that needs to be fleshed out, all right, to see like whether it's feasible or not, and to understand the basic ground rules of how these bacteria are behaving and how they might be, and how we could deal with those bacterial colonies, say with maybe viral invasion or something like that. This isn't research that a pharmaceutical company is going to do. A pharmaceutical company, beholden to its stakeholders, all right, to the stockholders, needs to show a profit, right? And so if you're saying, well, we're going to do this basic research, and maybe 5, 10 years from now, we'll find out that this could be something worth doing, and then you have to go through all the many hoops you have to go through in order to get something qualified to be able to use it in a clinical way. You're looking at 10 years out. High risk, potentially high reward, but the risk is so great that very few pharmaceuticals, if probably none, would probably do what this student is doing. So how are they able to do this? They come in with some basic knowledge. They're learning about biology, learning about biotechnology, learning various techniques. They're applying it to a very important question. And they're deriving new hypotheses for how we might approach this in a different way. And they're going through a whole series of experiments to show that it might be a plausible route to pursue in the future. And how is that research funded? It's funded through your tax dollars, all right, through the National Institutes of Health. And it could be the foundation of a new treatment, but it might not be for another 10 years to 20 years down the line. And I think this student represents a dying breed. There's going to be fewer of these students in the future. Budget cuts to NSF, NIH are systematically just dismantling this engine that's made America the global leader in scientific innovation. This is where innovation comes from. Yes, the innovations come from private endowments. They do come from pharmaceutical companies and other organizations, other companies. But underlying all of that is the basic research just to understand how things work. Even if you don't have a particular product that you're going to sell in your mind at the end of this research that you've developed. See, I'm a professor at a public university, and I'm here to tell you that the scientific breakthroughs that have transformed your life, right, came from research that might have seemed completely useless, when it started. Like PCR. I have multiple PCR machines in my lab, use PCR on a regular basis, polymerase chain reaction, copying DNA strands. Well, that technique, right, that made maybe rapid COVID testing possible early on in the pandemic, to do genetic testing, to do all kinds of things, thousands of different possibilities with PCR. You hear about it all the time on all the crime shows, right? I mean, that was just developed by, or could only be developed because people were studying heat-loving bacteria in Yellowstone hot springs. Just trying to understand, like, how do bacteria live at really high temperatures? How is their biology fundamentally altered? And the microbiologists studying that weren't necessarily thinking about what product can I make from this. They're simply trying to understand the diversity of life. And through the understanding of the vast amount of diversity and biochemical complexity, we understand that some of those things can lead us to new innovations, new things we never thought about. And somebody thought, bacteria lives at really high temperature. They must have an enzyme that survives at that high temperature that, doesn't survive in you at that temperature. And maybe if we extract that particular enzyme from those organisms and use it for this process called PCR, that's kicked off an entire scientific revolution. Wouldn't have been possible if nobody had actually studied those bacteria. CRISPR, gene editing, right? We're using it to change and alter DNA. Whatever your opinion about that is, it's a technology, right? And it started just by trying to understand, how does a bacteria defend itself against a virus? How do bacteria survive the onslaught of viruses out there in nature? Oh, they have these really nifty ways of protecting themselves by identifying the viruses they're attacking them, snipping them up and putting little pieces in their own genome so they'll be able to identify that virus later. CRISPR. What about, you're watching this video, right? I mean, where did this technology come from? Supported by DARPA, National Science Foundation. It's all about just basic research into network connections and transistors and so forth, right? Basic electronics comes from original basic research. So here's the point. You can't predict which basic research is going to lead to revolutionary applications. That's exactly why pharmaceutical companies and private industry won't fund this. This is why they're not doing this. You can't simply say, well, capitalism will take over and somebody's going to want to develop this new way of, treating wounds in diabetics because that's a big market. But we already have tools. We already have things that we can use which make a lot of money. They're not necessarily the most effective, but they are the most cost effective, right? And they have the highest profit value, right? But if somebody were to discover another way that's more effective and work out all the details, eventually you could monetize that. But the path to that there's so much resistance to that, there's so much risk to that pathway that you're going to keep doing the simple thing, which is just keep whacking it with antibiotics. And so it's basic research. It's students, mostly, it's professors at universities who are interested in doing research and interested in discovery and training. And that's the other piece of this puzzle. It is about training. Where are pharmaceutical companies and other organizations even going to get researchers if they can't be trained? And the way we train them is, and mostly in a university setting, where you go through the process of doing science. And that does cost money. It's not free, right? So there's another crisis that is looming. It was already looming, but I think it's going to get a lot worse with these budget cuts because we simply aren't going to bring as many students in because we can't afford it. We can't afford to do that training. So there's a collapse of training of the next generation of scientists in America. And then you heap on sort of the anti-science sort of sentiment in society. There's fewer people even wanting to go into science because they see the way that scientists are treated. So graduate students and postdocs, they really are, I hate to put it this way, but they are the cheapest, most motivated scientific labor force in the world, right? They want to get the experience. because they want to get that job. They want to get into certain forms of research, want to work at a company, right? They want to be a doctor or research a clinician. And they want to get their schooling, which costs money, but they can get that partially paid for through the research that they're doing. So you can get training and get paid for it at the same time. I'm not saying you're getting paid a lot. Our graduate students only make around $20,000 a year. And it's really $20,000 plus they're not paying tuition. So, it's like $30,000 to $35,000. Not bad, but not like living it up either. Right. And it's hard work. And these students don't just work 8 to 5. Typically, they're in the lab on the weekends. They're thinking about things. They're reading. They're they're devoted to this. They really need to. In order to get a PhD, it's a tremendous amount of work. So for $30,000 a year, you're getting a lot of productivity out of that person, in addition to the fact that you're training somebody for the future. As opposed to, hey, I've got a PhD. I'm going to go work for a pharmaceutical company. And I'm only going to be working 40 hours a week, not 60 to 80 hours a week, right? And so I'm going to have to pay that person $150,000 a year for a really experienced industry scientist, right? So basic research is one of the most efficient, things that government dollars do. And of course, you can point to projects that don't work out, right? Had this great hypothesis. We researched it. It really doesn't pan out. It's not going to turn into anything. Even those negative results sometimes are helpful. It means somebody else doesn't have to repeat that experiment and have that idea again, right? They can look in the literature because hopefully they've published it. That's another thing about publishing, right? I can see what people have done prior to me and say, like, how does my idea fit in with that? How can I judge the quality of my idea against what is already known, and to help me come up with new ideas, new hypotheses that need to be tested. So they're not just cheap labor, though. They're the next generation of researchers, and they have to come from somewhere. And the most efficient way to make a future researcher is through the process that we have developed since the 1960s, which is government-sponsored research, basic research, which then is the thing that helps propagate expertise into society, into companies and people that are putting that where they then can be honing in on specific products and things that might be aiding us or in the environment. Every Nobel Prize winner, every biotech entrepreneur, like every medical researcher, they all started out as graduate students funded by agencies like National Institutes of Health and NSF. And what we're doing right now is we're proposing cutting that by 50%. Cutting that by 50% and cutting universities' take on that research, which doesn't allow them to develop the facilities to enable sort of the corporate research that goes on. Everybody just doesn't have all their own equipment in their own lab and never use it. There's joint equipment, there's space involved in terms of heating and cooling, all that stuff. It's expensive, but it's still nonetheless one of the most efficient and economical ways in order to gain expertise, in order to create new technologies and new ideas. So if we cut funding to agencies, we're not just stopping the current research that's happening right now. And everybody can identify some research projects that I just don't find any value in that. I don't want my tax dollars going to that. But you put it all together into a whole. And what you find out is that the dollar spent, your tax dollar spent, is going to create many more dollars than the dollar that was spent. Right? Basic research results in medical breakthroughs, economic innovations. I mean, there's even national security elements here. Right? We need expertise in order to stay ahead of all the other countries that are also trying to gain expertise in certain areas like synthetic biology, quantum computing, AI. Lots of talk about that. And don't even get me started on internationals coming here and getting expertise as if they're just like getting their expertise and then taking it home with them. Yes, they are doing that some, but we also gain huge benefits from the work that they actually do here. Like, here's what drives me crazy about these budget cuts. They're just so incredibly short-sighted economically. The NIH budget is about $45 billion per year. I know that sounds like a whole lot of money until you realize that's like less money than Americans spend on pizza each year. Right? It's about what the military spends in about 6 weeks. And what's the return on your investment? Studies have shown that every dollar invested in National Institute of Health research generates about $2 to $3 in economic activity. The Human Genome Project. I often tell my students in my genomics class, this is one of those projects where it was expensive, but we came in under budget. And the amount of economic activity that's been generated from the Human Genome Project that did cost several $billions and took over 13 years. Talk about having some foresight, right? Actually doing, the Congress did something that they wouldn't see a result for 10 years. Seems unheard of today to think that far ahead. But what did we get out of that? We got at least $1 trillion in economic impact. The benefits of the Human Genome Project, which is something that no individual or no company would take on. Now, I know you're going to say like there was another company that actually also sequenced the human genome. They got started a few years later after the technology started to increase. They recognized that they could find another way to sequence the human genome even faster. They got done about the same time. All right, so I'll acknowledge that. But here's the thing. How did they manage to sequence the genome much faster? It's because your taxpayer dollars, they took the first several hundred million dollars, and they didn't invest it directly in getting the sequence. All right, just like, okay, let's start looking at A, T, C, G, C, G. They invested it into grants that went to institutions like MIT and Harvard and all these other places, Penn State, and there's a place in UCLA, right? They took that money and they worked on creating better sequencers, better technology to learn how to sequence DNA faster, better, more efficiently, and more accurately. And so we invested in graduate students, PhD students, who came up with ideas for different kinds of sequencers, different technologies, not ones that would pay off in some like corporate sense of like, hey, I got this new technology, I'll make a ton of money on this, right away. Because it was, many of them were very risky ideas. But you know what? Several of them panned out. And then there was a company that they took that and just ran with it and sequenced the human genome really quickly. Right? And today we benefit from vastly better technology than even when they were done with the Human Genome Project. But all that was begun by taxpayer dollars very intentionally doing basic science, learning basic things about DNA replication in order to understand how we could technologically increase our capacity for that. So once you lose scientific capacity, once you lose the researchers, once you lose the graduate students, you don't have the next generation. You're not generating new basic research as efficiently as you were. And you're not creating researchers who will take that basic research and turn it into products. Right? So we're losing an entire cohort. If this budget cut continues and the current environment continues for a couple of years, we're going to lose a generation of future scientists. Well, we're going to lose them, but they are going to go somewhere, right? Some of them just won't ever become scientists, right? We're turning people off to going into science. Some people want to be scientists, but they're just not going to find a position. We are turning away students, and many other institutions are like going to have more applicants than they can handle because they don't have enough funds to be able to take them on. And part of that's because there's professors there that aren't going to be getting grants. And if they're not getting grants, then they can't recruit students in order to work in their lab. So they're going to have fewer students in each lab. And where are those students going to go? Like I said before, they're just going to have to give up on that dream, or they're going to go out of the country. Or more importantly, many of them that would have come here to work in our labs, some of the best from other countries come here, so that our faculty get to take advantage of having some of the best students doing the best research in the world. Even if some of those leave afterwards, we've gained a lot from that. But now those who would be coming into our labs and doing that, there's only so much room. We'll have some students, but many of those are seeking other places. Sometimes because they couldn't get in, but often it's because they don't want to come anymore, right? Australia has an initiative to bring in more graduate students, right? To do more with their, they're inviting the Chinese, they're inviting other people from other places in the world to come to Australia and bolster their research. China is actively increasing the amount of research at their many, many universities. And rather than have their students go out to other parts of the world to get expertise, they have enough expertise now locally, and they're developing their own. And this just tips the tables, right? It says, like, before, it's like, go to Harvard, go to Yale, go to these various places in the US, get some training, come back. Maybe we don't need to do that anymore. And this just makes it easier to make that decision to keep all of their students at home. Yeah. So while we're arguing about, science funding being cut by double digits, they're increasing science funding by double digits. They're recruiting the best scientists from their own population. They're even recruiting students from outside of China now with offers that we no longer can match. And while we're arguing about whether basic science is actually worth funding, they're investing in researchers who are going to develop the technologies for the future. So let me be a little more personal, I guess. I mean, the student who just defended, right? And she passed, and she's a newly minted PhD. And fortunately, she has a postdoc to go to at the University of Chicago. And so she's going to be going into a really good lab. It's actually a fairly new faculty member there who's looking for her first students. She's going to be one of the first people to go in there as a postdoctoral research associate. And this faculty member has funding, has NIH funding, has already secured it. Now, I'm afraid when I say already secured it, the U.S. government has actually been retracting grants. Not just stopping new grants from going forward, but actually retracting people's money after they already think they have it. And maybe they've already brought a student in and promised them, like, hey, I've got 3 years of funding, come here. They get here, and after a year, the money disappears. Essentially, the student is unable to continue. Many students will be unable to continue in projects and in programs in which they thought they were secured a position. In this case, I think she has funding in a particular area that won't be cut. And so she'll be able to pursue and continue her education in a slightly different field than she is now in order to gain a broader experience. And then she'll be ready to go out into, become a faculty member herself and go into private industry. Right? She's totally brilliant, absolutely motivated. We've got 5 years of research out of her. In my case, she was my graduate assistant for my genetics lab. Right? Because for a couple of years, she did a teaching assistantship rather than a research assistantship where the money comes from the grant. The money for her research in terms of the supplies was still coming from the grant, but not providing her salary, in which case the university is picking up her salary as a teaching assistantship, and what she's doing to earn that pay would be to help out in various labs, and one of them was mine. And I know that, like I told her when she left, it would have been hard for me to survive without her. Very organized, came up with new labs, all kinds of innovative ideas for my lab, which, I'm like, thank you very much, right? And exceptionally good at explaining to students how these tools work and talking to the students about, here's a sophomore in college and she's a graduate student. And I can talk about my experience, and I do, right? I come in, I talk about DNA extraction and all things that happened to me, and I give like personal experiences, but she's living in the moment, right? She's learning this stuff and applying it in her active research, and she can talk about that research with the students, and the students can see, hey, that's what scientists do. And so it's that kind of training that is another thing that we're getting out of having graduate students be involved in our program. So every time we lose a scientist like her, I mean, she's intelligent enough, could do a lot of different things besides just this science thing, right? She could have gone in directly into a variety of other basic jobs in science and done perfectly fine. So if this opportunity wasn't there, which it may not be in the future, we're really going to lose out on really training somebody who has really great skills, but might not have been able to achieve her full potential, right, without this funding. So it's not just about science. It's about whether we're going to lead as a country in innovation, becoming rather than just becoming a sort of a technological backwater, right? Relying on others to generate tools. There's a whole lot more to learn. If you think that we know it all, far from it. I sit on plenty of dissertation committees and I see lots of students' projects. And so I get to explore lots of interesting areas. And it's just amazing how many times it's like, well, nobody knows anything about that. Nope, no one's actually looked at that. Nope, I don't know how that would interact. I don't know how those bacteria, survive in that particular environment. I don't know what would happen if, that virus were to infect that bacteria in that particular environment. Somebody's got to actually look at it at some point. So where do we go from here? If I were to explain her research, you might find it somewhat esoteric to yourself. You might not really see the application directly. But in 20 years, it might be the foundation of saving many, many lives, or at least making the lives of many people much better for longer. So basic research or basic science, it's a long-term investment. It's a long-term investment in people. It's a long-term investment in our future, humanity's future. It's a long-term investment in America's future, right? You can choose to make that investment, or you can watch other countries surpass us and wonder what happened to America's scientific leadership. Are we just going to be consumers? I mean, we're already very much of a consumer type society, right? But it's scientific innovation that's the one thing where we're still a leader in the world. That can slip away very, very quickly, especially in this modern environment where the forms of expertise that we once were way above everyone, many other countries have been catching up. And it'll be very easy to fall behind. So cutting science funding, I don't think it's just bad policy. It is a huge gamble with America's future that I don't think we can afford to lose. So yeah, I'm just, it is frustrating to see many good projects that now, and I've seen many good faculty who do research that are just like, I don't know if it's worth me, spending all this time to propose a project for which I have a 1 in 100 chance of actually getting some funding for. And I can't do the project without some form of funds. These funds aren't like, hey, my salary is going to go way up because I have these big grants. I mean, yes, there is some financial advantage to the faculty member to have large grants, but mostly it's the other people that you're hiring, right? It's the technicians. It's also hiring and having undergraduates in the lab. That's the thing with this student that just graduated. She had many, many undergraduates in her lab that helped her on those projects, allowing her to do even more than she could do by herself, but she was training those undergraduates. So there's undergraduates who thinking maybe they're going to go to medical school, right? And they're getting an experience, an authentic experience doing novel research, discovering new things, not simply taking my genetics lab where, they go through the motions of a scientific project, but it's one that's set up and we kind of know what we're going to get. It's not nearly as exploratory. Yeah, they're learning some techniques, they're learning some tools, but they don't get to see the scientific enterprise like truly in action unless you're working with a doctoral student who is trying to push the boundaries and discover and find new knowledge. So that's the end of my rant. I don't really know what else to say. It's been a real privilege for me to have PhD students, to see them go through that process and now see them successfully doing things. I have an ex-PhD student who runs the research for a children's hospital locally, right? Coordinates the research for them and does her own research there. And it's been amazing to watch her trajectory as she's learned different tools and techniques and written grants and so forth. So right now she has some foundation money in order to get projects started. But the idea is that you use those funds to try out different projects that are maybe a little bit like pretty speculative or high risk projects. You get a few students working on those. You find, okay, these results look promising. And then you say like, okay, I'll use that data as preliminary data to apply for National Institutes of Health money or National Science Foundation money, taxpayer dollar money. And you competitively work to try to get that funds. In that case, you're going to have to try to prove that you have something that is more than just a wild hypothesis, right? You've got some preliminary data. You have some evidence to suggest you might be on the right path, but you need more money in order to broaden that out and provide the basis of, in order to provide more evidence that it's going to be worth even continuing further. And so what you would do is hopefully get that funds. And then at the end of that project, you're then going to basically shop those products to pharmaceutical companies and other interested individuals that will take that and monetize those results. So it's a stepwise process. It's rarely done with like just starting from scratch and building a product by a company that's interested in profit. And this is where government funding is seeding. It's like it's the base level of developing an entire industry that then everybody else benefits from. So it's long-term strategy. It's long-term funds for future prosperity. That's what funding basic research does. So that's it. That's just thoughts I had after experiencing yet another week of enjoying seeing one of our students reach that next level of like being an expert in their field and just wondering, what is their future? What is their future? Many graduate students that I've talked to are very concerned about whether there are jobs out there for them, what they're going to be able to do, or whether they're even going to be able to finish what they're doing now because the funding is drying up. All right, that's it. Rant off. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.